It's Wednesday, November 20th, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, we're taking a little break from the hard news, and instead we have a fascinating piece of Michigan State University history. You might know about radar guns in baseball. You might have seen them at your cousin's high school baseball game, measuring the speed of the pitches and whatnot. But did you know that that practice was created on accident here at Michigan State? Our reporter Hannah is here to tell us all about it.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for coming on the show. And this is a great story. And it's fun because it's kind of like a circle, right? You wrote this story for the State News, but it also is sort of about a State News story. Yeah. And so why don't you start me off the way your story starts? Tell us about, you have this guy reading the State News and this idea forms.
Yeah, so it all started with this small article that was actually one of the reporter's very first stories that he wrote.
Yeah.
And it was just this small little piece about this new technology the police department had got to catch people speeding. And the MSU baseball coach at the time, Danny Litweiler, was reading the paper and saw this article and decided to call up MSU PD and see if they could park that cruiser on the field to see if it could measure the speed of pitches. So they brought the cruiser to the field, parked it between home plate and first base, and he had them throw pitches, and it came back with a seemingly accurate response. And then from there, it took off.
So they're using this technology like in the police car to actually read like the speed of the pitches that they're throwing with the car parked on the field.
So the original radar gun was attached to the police cruiser. So it wasn't the handheld gun we see today.
Yeah.
You had to have the cruiser there initially.
Well, what were they doing? Because I think of like these radar guns as kind of synonymous with like baseball and pitching.
Yeah.
But it's funny that I guess only 50 years old. Baseball is like the American pastime. What were they doing before that? Did they have a way to measure pitches? How were they like scouting and looking at players?
Yeah, it was a lot less mathematical and more based almost on superstition. They had a technique back then called the good face, where there was a specific face that you could see and it would imply that person would be a good player and be hardworking. So it's kind of almost off looks, but they also kind of had a crazy approach. A lot of coaches would climb up into trees to get different angles of throws and plays to see how well a player was. So it was definitely less analytical than it is now with the gun.
This is the first kind of like empirical, like actual like way of measuring baseball players objectively when they're throwing. Before it was these good faces.
Yeah, which has its pros and cons because the more mathematical approach has brought in way more of an emphasis on speed, which has kind of led to players overthrowing their arms. And the radar gun is almost linked to this surgery called Tommy John surgery, which is for players to help with their elbows when they overthrow them, to help repair that so they can get back to that full speed pitch.
So it's not so much about like the good face and everything, it's just about the number on the thing.
Yeah.
So there are detractors to this invention.
Yeah.
But speaking of which, you actually, this one, people listen to the 1909, they probably know about. It's very like synonymous with baseball.
Yeah.
This coach, you have a part of your story we're talking about, he had a bunch of other inventions that were not as popular and like well liked, but he was sort of like a serial inventor. What else was created at MSU that didn't take off?
Yeah, so he's actually responsible for over 100 inventions.
Yeah.
But some of his other ones, another one is actually pretty prevalent, which is diamond dust, which was initially started, he was at I believe a football game with his neighbor who's a chemical engineer. And they saw how hard it was to dry off a ball when it gets wet in the rain. So they created this dust that would make it easier to put on the ball and it would dry it. And that eventually turned into a dust that could be used for an entire field. And MSU still uses that, and I believe teams in the MLB still use that to dry their fields when it rains.
Because they play on like the dirt. That's crazy.
Yeah.
What were some of his like less popular inventions that didn't work out?
I don't know if this one is super popular. I think they used it at the MSU baseball camp when Litweiler was coach. It was the bunting bat. And it was a bat that had, I believe, like the front cut out of it to help practice bunting. So that was a pretty cool one.
So what about, but sort of his I guess, most impressive achievement, the radar gun. How does it go from, like, this cop car that he was parking on the field to measure his players to this thing that everybody has?
Yeah, so he reached out to the company that created the one that goes into the cruiser, and they were only interested in using it for public safety purposes. So then he reached out to Jugs, and they created their own version. They're a baseball company.
I see.
I believe they make pitching gloves, like other baseball technologies. And so they created their own handheld version, and then it kind of grew from there, where you didn't have to have the cruiser, and also having a well-known baseball company selling it also helped.
And that's like the one that it looks like a gun, like you hold it by the handle.
Yeah, and you hold it. And then he also messaged the MLB commissioner at the time to let him know about this invention, that this could be done, and that also is what helped it to grow.
So he's spreading the word, but like I came up with this genius thing.
He wasn't just wanting to use it for himself. He was like, let me spread this to the whole community.
And do they use them at MSU today, like the coaches and whatnot?
Yes, they still very much use them. The current pitching coach said they bring them to all scouting events, all games, check out competition. I think it's very much an essential part of the game now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a great story. It's something that I think you see out in the world. I never knew had this whole history at MSU with this amazing kind of coincidence putting the cop car in the field and all that. Mm-hmm. Well, Hannah, thank you for uncovering this fun history and for coming on the show. We'll be back next week with more great reporting from the fresh minds here at State News. And until then, you can read Hannah's full story on statenews.com. Thanks again for coming on. Thank you to Taylor, our podcast coordinator, and most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.